Mix It with Mike, plugin of the week, comes from Softube. It's the Overstayer MAS plugin. Overstayer is a company based in California here in the United States that makes some hardware gear, some very good, very sought after hardware gear that's very popular, and this is one of them. It's the MAS model 8101. And what you have is basically a saturation device that has some filters prior to the saturation. We have an input to determine the amount of saturation, a wet-dry control, an output control to balance the difference from the gain coming in, and then a series of different forms of distortion. There are two forms of the plugin. You have the normal plugin here, which is true to the original, with some additional added filter types, which I'll get into in a bit. Also an added auto gain, so you don't have to simultaneously turn down the output. It will automatically do that for you. And also a button that mixes the amount of gain into the dry signal, so that when you do the wet-dry, it's a little bit more consistent and even. So some nice features there. Also some extended metering for the amount of saturation, which is important. There is also an extended version. The extended version takes this up to a whole other level by adding a whole EQ section that will work both prior to and after the distortion section. Other than the filters, the main EQ sections is a 4-band EQ, and as you raise one up, it will raise the output level down to compensate for the opposite. So this way you can really target the saturation within the frequency zone that you want. And that's the basic concept of it. If we look at the signal flow, just to kind of give you like a quick idea of what goes on, what we have is the high pass, high shelf, and low shelf filters, which are right at the beginning. So this is all original unit. The input gain control, that big knob on the left. Then the signal goes straight through. So this would be the extended circuit for high pass, low pass, and pre-EQ, all that sort of stuff. The saturation, the post-EQ stuff, if you have that on. Auto gain control, which is added in by Softube. And then the wet-dry control that blends the dry signal passing through here along with the wet signal to the output, right? And then you have the output volume that's there. So all of the features that are added in get switched in different places. If you hit the to dry switch, then it adds the input gain signal to the dry gain, right? So that it can be additive or subtractive depending upon what you do with it. That's the basic signal flow of the circuit. In practical application, really what you have here are three different types of distortion. So if we use it from the most basic way that it was designed by the company itself. Let's start there and kind of build ourselves outward. So I'll hide the other plugin here and we'll continue with this. What I have here, so actually I can just stretch this out a little bit, make it so that we can see it. Really, it's pretty simple. I keep the auto button in and then I can drive some saturation. So let's start with just some drums. I'm going to leave it at drums and no bass here for a second. Get rid of this other plugin window and let's just start right here. Right? Basic distortion, sounds good. Now I have a couple of different modes that I can go into here. This is a dual stage mode, which creates two paths in serial, right? And another one that adds a second order or pushes more second harmonics into the distortion. And then an emphasis circuit. And what the emphasis circuit does is it actually sort of tilts the signal in. So more of the distortion kind of pushes into the upper frequencies and less with the lower frequencies. So what you get there is a cleaner low end, which you hear right away. Now, there are a series of different options when you select the emphasis button. If this is off, you notice these are off. And these are other filter shape types. So for example, the low bandwidth one will primarily distort lows and highs. right? So you really hear that in the kick drum and on the top end, right? Then there's a low presence, which is really kind of designed for vocals. It gives you more upper mid distortion to sort of soften that. Right, then we have a high presence. Now it's sort of backward here because, part of what you drive distortion in what frequency zone that you drive the distortion in, what it will do is it will soften that area or collapse that area or the amount of gain that would normally push through in that area. So when you drive saturation into, say, low frequencies, it's not giving you more low frequency. It's actually flattening out the low frequency content. And that may be a sound that you're going for, but it's a little counterintuitive if you don't think of it in that specific light. And so that's just one thing I wanted to point out. This one is also kind of designed for vocals. It's an emphasis on the lower high range is what they describe it. But let's just go back and forth the difference between these two. And I'll check this out with vocals in a minute. One that's specific to bass distortion. Right? So if you drive super low frequency, you can hear it there. And one that's like a warming type of thing, they describe it as like a tape-like sound. And so I'm exaggerating it here just to kind of show you the differences. Sometimes, depending upon the instrument that you apply it into, it will give you a more subtle effect. Sometimes it'll be a very dramatic effect. And so I'm driving a lot of energy into this, probably much more than I would. Or if I was doing this, then I would work into parallel. Right, so if we take this kind of to another level and we close this, open up this one here, now we can sort of expand upon this whole idea by really targeting very specific frequencies. So there's a thing here, there's a high-pass filter and a low-pass filter that have a resonant setting on it, so it defaults to 5. So what that means, if you set it to 0, it acts like a normal 12 dB per octave filter, and it will be applied to the audio signal. So you will hear it. It will disappear unless you pull the mix control back, and then you'll get more of the original unprocessed signal, right? So the high pass and low pass you will hear, and it will simultaneously also feed into the saturation, right? So just be aware of it from that perspective. Then you have a 4-band EQ. So what's interesting here is that when we apply compensation to this, what we have is a low-frequency shelf. And the low-frequency shelf is really targeted at 150 hertz. The high-frequency shelf is targeted at 7.5K. But you'll notice that there is two things here, right? There is the knob, and then there's this other compensation. So this is how much on the low end and the high end is going into the saturation circuit. This is a compensation that's an inverse of that that's on the output of that. So this would allow me to target in those specific ranges, low and high. So have to put the emphasis button in. There we go. Yes, the emphasis button does have to be in. So that would be one way to go about it. And if you turn the compensation off, for example, I could put this in, have it saturate more, and then right? So it's not auto compensating, and that would allow me to kind of put it back to whatever setting that I want to. But as we get into specific things, and this is really great for individual instruments, you can then target that saturation. And again, I'm really exaggerating it here, just to be for example, I can drive into more specific frequencies. So now I have somewhat of a parametric EQ, although no Q control, but at least I have a frequency control. And the frequency control, there are two of them. They go from 50 hertz up to 20K. So this gives me two different zones that I can work with. Again, I could put the presence compensation on, right, on or off on either side. Right, so I could target that in one zone, target this one in another. Right, so if you get the basic idea of it here, you can now work within these controls here to help shape the sound as well. So you can see, just going instrument by instrument, how powerful of a tool this is, because it really allows you to kind of focus in and set exactly what you want to do. Plus, you have the high pass and low pass filters with the resonant. So the resonant will act like a normal 12 dB per octave. If you bring it up to 10, it will be like giving you a 3 dB resonant bump. And at the 5 setting, it's a 1 dB resonant bump right at the crossover frequency. So a lot to work with, a lot to digest here and kind of work with. So let's start with something like just simple, like bass part here. Let me just see here. If I start with a clean bass part. Oh, so just one thing here that I didn't get to, the specific frequency. So what you have here as part of the original circuit is a high shelf, which boosts 2 dB at 12K. This is, again, going into the saturation circuit, so this is not audible. Then you have a low shelf going in, which does 100 hertz and down, plus 2 dB. And then the high-pass filter is a two-pole resonant with a peak of 50 hertz, right? So you get a little bump there at 50 hertz. So here I could take, if I wanted to kind of cut a bit of the edge of this here, I could push in a little bit more of the distortion, believe it or not, into the warming end of this. Let me go to the verse section. Ooh, sorry about that. This obviously turns off the auto gain compensation. I could push into the bass distortion. So if you're just running that in parallel and you have a bass that's like super muddy, this would be a way of sort of flattening out the tubbiness of that low end by pushing more bass distortion, mixing it in parallel, and finding some combination between the two. But just like even from this, like the little bouncing around here, you can hear how powerful it is and how much control you have over it. Right, let's go over here to the, let's see, what did I do here? Oh, I wanted to show this, which was just the difference in tone from the vocal tracks, right?
Clutch onto this sinking ship, delude me into a state of bliss, offer me some peace in kind, rectify my inconsolable mind.
Right, so this is with the high presence and the low presence, okay? Let's check this out.
Clutch onto this sinking ship, delude me into a state of bliss, offer me some peace in kind, rectify my inconsolable mind.
Right, so one would be cutting a bit more of the high frequency response, which may be helpful for here. The other one would be cutting more of the mids, not so much the upper mids, right?
Clutch onto this sinking ship, delude me into a state of bliss, offer me some peace in kind, rectify my inconsolable mind.
Maybe I'll add a little second harmonic in there.
Clutch onto this sinking ship, delude me into a state of bliss, offer me some peace in kind, rectify my inconsolable mind.
Right, this is a way to sort of soften some of the sibilance and edge in there, bring out some richness and warmth into it. A lot of different ways that you can work this. Even digging into the extended version and getting into vocals and individual instruments, you could just go on and on and on. It's a really, really, really powerful tool. I think the auto gain compensation is really amazing. That's very powerful. Obviously, just in terms of keeping you from having to use shortcuts or kind of dart your way through different settings, but just even working with the basic settings here, just to get a sense of how it works, moving on to the extended version where you can really focus in on individual elements of the mix, is just an infinite way amount of possibilities in terms of tone shaping, or even if you want to use it in a more transparent way, just as a way of just like softening or cutting the edge off of your mix, right? Putting it on the mix bus, or if you have like a particular grouping of instruments here, like in any of these stems where you feel the guitars are a bit too edgy and you just kind of give it something that kind of, cuts a little bit of the peak harshness. The whole design of this is meant to really replace compression in terms of controlling or clipping peaks, where compressors are time-based, right? You have an attack time and a release time in terms of its control of any given peak. This is just essentially using components to round off peaks, and then where you push the energy determines where that rounding occurs in the frequency spectrum. But the principal design of it was a way of cutting the edge of sounds and giving it a bit more warmth and listenability. It's all really just about analog. Again, I'm showing you pretty exaggerated things, but when you use it in a more subtle way, you can find that you get a nice added body or warmth or analogness to the sound. It's a great hardware device. This is an amazing emulation done by Softube, and I think this is one that will easily, very quickly, fall right into your toolkit in terms of just processors that you can use to, really do some amazing tone shaping. So there you have it. Plugin of the week, Softube, Overstayer, MAS.